In the uneasy weeks after the war, Camino Ward still smelled like ash. The cleanup crews had done what they could. They hauled broken concrete, tagged collapsed buildings with colored flags, red for structural failure, yellow for partial green for standing but compromised, and tried to pretend the system was still moving. It wasn't not really. Some of those flags had been out long enough to fade. Deku moved through Evacuation Shelter 7 at a pace that wasn't quite a run. His hero costume was dusty at the knees. The support gauntlets had a new crack along the left forearm that the support course hadn't gotten to yet. And his boots left faint prints on the shelter floor where someone had tracked in loose gravel from outside. Around him, cots ran in long rows under the converted gymnasium ceiling. Children slept. Old men sat at the edges of their cots and stared at nothing. Near the far wall, a woman cried quietly into a phone that had no signal still talking into it anyway. 50 meters above the shelter, a news drone circled. The hero system had not collapsed. That was the official line, and it was technically accurate. Heroes still showed up. Dispatch still routed calls. The ranking board still updated. But the machinery had seized at the joints, and anyone who depended on it could feel the grinding. Pro-heroes were being pulled in 5 directions at once. Villain remnants hit soft targets, while top-ranked heroes held disaster sites across 3 prefectures. The public watched the numbers and did the math. They saw Endeavor anchored at Osaka, while a smaller city in Aichi went dark for 6 hours. They saw Hawks managing a structural collapse in Yokohama, while fire spread unchecked across residential blocks in Saitama. The heroes were there. They were just not enough, and people old enough to count had stopped pretending otherwise. The anger had nowhere useful to go, so it went everywhere. At the intake desk, near the entrance, a man in his 40s was yelling at a volunteer. Not a villain. Just a man whose apartment had been red flagged and who had been waiting 9 days for a relocation assessment that kept getting delayed. The volunteer was trying. The man was not interested in trying. In the cot row nearest the door, 3 people lay with their eyes open, watching, not moving. Deku slowed, cataloged it in 2 seconds, kept walking. There was a family near the back exit, without a food allocation since yesterday. He had a bag. He had a destination. The yelling man was not the most urgent problem in the room, and knowing that didn't make it sit any better. That was the thing about the aftermath. Every moment required a triage that felt wrong, no matter how you ran it. He was halfway down the row when his earpiece clicked. Midoriya. Aizawa's voice had the texture of a door closing. Finish your sweep. East Gate. Bring Todoroki. What kind of contact? A beat. The kind I don't have a category for yet. Move. The line cut. Namni. They had come in from the northwest. No vehicle. No portal flash. No crack of displaced air that usually marked a teleportation class quirk. The surveillance camera on the corner of Izumi Dori caught the transition in a single frame gap, clear street, then 2 figures standing on the sidewalk outside, what had been a noodle restaurant and was now a distribution point. They stood as if they'd always been there and had simply chosen to become visible. The system flagged them in under 20 seconds. Not because of anything they'd done. The threat assessment software scanned both figures and returned output the display didn't know how to show. Where a color-coded severity bar should have filled in there was only black. Not red. Not the overflow marker reserved for S-class incidents. Black. Flat. And beneath it 3 words, measurement ceiling exceeded. The duty officer stared at that screen for 4 seconds. Then called Endeavor's dispatch line. The noodles were acceptable. Not good. Beerus had eaten noodles across more star systems than this civilization had managed to name, and whatever had produced this particular variant had not been operating at its best. The broth was thin. He ate anyway, because he had been awake for 11 minutes, and his expectations for the first meal of any given day were adjusted accordingly. The city around him was making noise in a way he found immediately unpleasant. Not the noise of a proper battle which at least had structure. Not the noise of a celebration. This was the noise of something broken, pretending it wasn't, and it produced a low, constant grating that sat at the back of his awareness like a splinter. "This place," he said, "is irritating." Whis glanced mildly at the row of faded flags on the nearest building. "It has been through some difficulty. Everything has been through difficulty. That's not the point." He took another mouthful. Above them, a drone completed its third low pass. He did not look up at it. "It keeps circling," he said. "Yes, I believe it's attempting to assess you. It's been 3 passes. What is it waiting for? Courage, perhaps? Or a better algorithm?" Beerus set the bowl down on a low concrete barrier and looked up for the first time. 4 figures had positioned themselves across the width of the street, roughly 60 meters out. The largest stood at the front. A tall man built like something intended to end arguments fire, contained in careful tension across his shoulders and jaw, not displayed but present the way a blade is present inside a scabbard. To his left, a leaner figure held something bright, folded against his back posture, loose in the way that meant the looseness was practiced. Third was a man in dark clothing who had taken the lowest stance of any of them, watching with the particular stillness of someone running numbers behind their eyes. A fourth stood slightly ahead of where positioning would have placed him. Green hair, a crack visible along the left gauntlet, young enough that the others had probably told him not to be in front. A 5th figure occupied the rooftop above the 3rd building on the right. Beerus registered it without looking. Stationary, high ground, watching angles. The young one in front was the only one holding eye contact. Beerus looked at him for a moment, then looked at the bowl. The noodles had gone cold. That more than the surveillance drone, more than the 5 humans blocking the road, more than the noise and the faded flags and the general grim condition of this street was what he found genuinely annoying. At the far end of the block, the large man with fire in his shoulders took 1 step forward. Endeavor stopped 6 meters out. Not because he was afraid, because he had not survived 20 years at the top of the rankings by walking into unknown variables without reading them first. He stood where he stood and let the fire settle low across his shoulders, present not displayed, and looked at the figure sitting on the broken concrete barrier with a bowl of noodles going cold in one hand. The figure looked back at him with the mild, faintly irritated interest of someone interrupted during something they considered more important. Hawks drifted to a stop on Endeavor's left wings, folded to a quiet angle. He had run his own red on the approach, the way the figure held the bowl, the way neither subject had shifted since the team arrived, the way the taller one with the staff simply watched with an expression that suggested he found the whole situation mildly educational. Hawks filed all of it and said nothing. Behind them, Aizawa had positioned himself at the mouth of the side street, goggles up, capture scarf loose at his shoulders. He had already considered the obvious play and already set it aside. Whatever this was, it wasn't a quirk situation. In any sense, he had a working model for. Using erasure required knowing what he was looking at. He didn't know what he was looking at. So he watched, and he thought, and he kept his hands still. Deku was at Endeavor's right shoulder, half a step back. He had been cataloging since before they reached the street. Energy signature, nothing readable. Threat posture absent. Killing intent, the pressure that radiated off someone building toward violence, also absent. What he picked up instead was something without a name in his notes. Not aggression, not calculation. Something closer to standing next to a very large, very old piece of machinery that wasn't running yet and hadn't decided whether it needed to. "Sir," Hawks low, not moving his eyes from the two figures. "You feel that?" "I feel something," Endeavor said. "Not heat, not force." Hawks paused. "Weight. Like pressure without a source." Endeavor said nothing. He took one more step forward and spoke, voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being the thing that stopped other things. "You're in a restricted zone. We need you to identify yourselves and move to a secure location for assessment." The purple figure looked at him with the patience of someone waiting for a translation. The taller one, white hair, staff robes that didn't belong to any nation or flag Endeavor had ever dealt with, smiled pleasantly and said, "How thoughtful of you. I'm afraid we were simply passing through." Lord Beerus had an interest in the local cuisine. Lord. Hawks caught the word the same instant Endeavor did. He saw the muscle in Endeavor's jaw shift and set. "We'll need more than that," Endeavor said. "Of course." The taller one tilted his head slightly. "Though I do want to mention gently that whatever your system registered about us, the situation is considerably less urgent than the reading suggests. Provided," he added, tone unchanged, "that no one does anything rash." Deku's eyes went to the bowl. He couldn't explain the instinct, but the figure with the ears and the fading noodles had not looked at Endeavor again after that first exchange. He was looking at the bowl, and something in the set of his face reminded Deku less of a villain and more of someone deciding whether a minor disturbance was worth the energy. The thought arrived incomplete, unpolished. This wasn't about them as targets. Whatever risk existed in this street came from what he might do about the interruption to his meal. The idea didn't fully form before Deku filed it away, unsettled. The building had been red flagged for 3 weeks. 6 stories, Category 2 structural compromise evacuation, recommended but not cleared for demolition. The upper 2 floors had been empty since shortly after the war. The lower 4 still held 11 people, mostly squatters with nowhere better to go than a building that had been probably fine. The eastern support column had been probably fine right up until the math stopped working in its favor. No explosion, no dramatic fracture, just a shift in load distribution that compromised concrete had been quietly losing for 19 days. The upper facade peeled away from the frame and dropped 40 meters down, toward the corner where 3 civilians had been watching the standoff from what they decided was a safe distance. Beerus looked up, not at the falling facade, at the civilians. He raised one hand. The motion was smaller than swatting a fly. 300 square meters of concrete and rebar and embedded window frames ceased to exist approximately 4 meters above the ground. Not shattered, not vaporized. Gone the way a word disappears when you stop saying it. The air where the debris had been was empty, and the 3 civilians stood in the open space below, unharmed, staring up at nothing. The monitoring unit at the north perimeter had been running automated protocols since the initial call. 2 directives: observe and respond to any power demonstration capable of civilian casualties. The facade drop had triggered the second directive before anyone with authority could countermand it. A moment after Beerus's hand came down, the unit discharged a suppression array, a dual-band energy net, a physical restraint system rated for S-class containment. All of it crossed 50 meters at full deployment speed. The suppression array stopped 4 meters out, folded inward, and was gone. The energy net followed there, then not know. No impact, no residual charge, nothing to indicate it had carried any force at all. The restraint cables, physical rather than energy-based, traveling low and fast, ceased to exist along with everything else. The unit support officer had been standing at the edge of the deployment threshold. Young. Probably his first year past certification. He had hit the activation sequence because the protocol said to, and the protocol was all he had. Beerus looked at him, looked away. The officer was gone. Not thrown, not dropped. The space where he'd been held, only a thin drift of dust settling toward the pavement. The street went silent. Not quiet. Silent, the kind that happens when a crowd stops breathing at the same time and nobody wants to be the one who starts again. Endeavor's arm had come up on reflex, the kind that doesn't wait for thought. The fire across his shoulders had spiked without him consciously raising it. He held himself in place and let the silence sit because there was nothing useful to do with it. Deku hadn't moved. He was looking at the empty patch of sidewalk. He'd been in rooms with all for one. He'd seen quirks that killed fast, and quirks that killed slow, and quirks that left damage you could classify and document, even if the understanding came later than the terror. This was different in a way that sat wrong in his chest. There was no damage to classify. There was just a place where someone had been, and then wasn't, and the air had not bothered to mark the difference. Hawks had pulled back half a step on instinct wings, angling outward, then stopped himself because the instinct pointed at nothing useful. His feathers were reading air pressure the way they always did, sorting signal from background, and what they returned was effectively clean. No thermal bloom, no electromagnetic trace, no updraft from a discharge. The air around the figure with the ears registered the same temperature as everything else, as if the events of the last 10 seconds hadn't involved enough physical force to disturb the atmosphere. That was what put the cold in Hawk's stomach. Not the scale of it, the lack of footprint. Aizawa hadn't moved from the side street. He'd used erasure the moment the array deployed, targeting the purple figure, a reflex decision. It was what he could do, so he'd done it. No reaction. Not the flinch of someone whose ability had been interrupted. Not the shift of someone compensating. Nothing. Which meant either erasure hadn't reached whatever was happening, or the concept of a quirk being cancelled was simply not a relevant category here. Aizawa didn't know which. He filed both possibilities somewhere cold and stayed still. Across the street, the taller figure turned toward the scene with the mild expression of a man who had watched a houseplant tip over. "Ah," he said. "I did mention Rash." Beerus stood. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't look at any of them in particular. He walked 3 steps into the center of the road and stopped, and the pressure Hawks had noted earlier, the weight without a source, simply increased. Not from a gesture, not from a stance. From the fact of him deciding to occupy the space more fully than he had before. Endeavor did not step back. Everything physical in him wanted to. He didn't. Beerus looked at the dust still settling where the officer had been. "Noisy," he said. "Just that." He turned and walked back to the concrete barrier and sat down. Picked up the bowl. Set it down again when the temperature confirmed what he already knew. Watched the assembled heroes for a moment. Endeavor rigid at the front, Hawks with his wings held too carefully. Still Aizawa unreadable at the mouth of the alley. Deku staring at the empty patch of ground and clasped his hands lightly behind his back. "I would suggest," he said with the tone of someone offering directions to a place they hope you never have to go, "that you consider not doing that again." The footage ran on a 12-second loop. Someone had cut it tight, the facade dropping the hand, rising the debris gone, then the array deploying, then nothing where the officer had been. 12 seconds. Clean edit. It had been on 6 different platforms within 40 minutes of the incident. And by the time the Heroes Public Safety Commission, issued a content restriction order. The clip had already been screenshotted, re-uploaded, mirrored, and translated into 7 languages by people who had never been within 400 kilometers of Camino Ward. Inside Shelter 7, a man named Goto was watching it on his phone for the 11th time. He wasn't watching the officer. He was watching the building. 300 square meters of falling concrete, and it had just stopped being there. Not exploded, not deflected. The debris field simply didn't happen. The 3 civilians underneath were standing in open air a moment later, completely unharmed, looking up at where the structure had been, with a particular expression of people whose bodies hadn't caught up to the fact that they were alive. Goto lowered the phone. Around him, the shelter was doing what shelters did when something new and terrible entered the information ecosystem, fragmenting into arguments. They brought it here. The man, 3 cots down, same energy he'd had yesterday at the intake desk, different target now. The heroes drew it in. They always make it worse. It saved those people. A woman near the back, older, arms crossed. Whatever it is, it saved those people. This time. What about next time? What does next time look like if we try to fight it? You saw what happened to that officer. I saw heroes standing around doing nothing while they evacuated 6 blocks. They evacuated after. Deku moved through the argument without stopping. He had a water allocation to deliver to the family near the east exit. 2 minors who needed medical referrals and a structural assessment request that had been sitting unread since yesterday morning. He did those things in order. The argument continued behind him. He was on his way back through when a girl, maybe 8, sitting on a cot with her knees pulled up, held out her phone without a word. The 12-second loop. The hand. The debris not landing. "Is that real?" she asked. Deku crouched to her level. "Yes." "Is it going to do that to us?" "We're going to make sure it doesn't." The girl studied him with a careful assessment of someone who had already learned that reassurance and reality didn't always point the same direction. Deku held her gaze and didn't add anything to the promise. She looked back at her phone. He stood and kept moving. The hollow feeling in his chest had been there since yesterday, and he'd stopped trying to name it. Not fear exactly. Something more like the sensation of discovering that a floor he'd been standing on had been load-bearing for something he never knew was resting there. In the Joint Command Center 2 kilometers north, the situation board had run out of useful colors. The display system used a 7-tier threat classification green through black, with black reserved for nationally systemic scenarios. It had never used black before. The Camino Ward incident had been entered as black within 90 minutes of the clip going public, and the system immediately flagged a conflict. No existing response protocol applied. Hawk stood at the back of the room and watched Endeavor work through a briefing that was essentially a recitation of categories that didn't fit. Energy type unclassified. Quirk origin unconfirmed and possibly inapplicable. Threat radius indeterminate. Containment viability. The analyst paused on that one for a fraction too long under review. Endeavor asked 3 questions. The answers were variations of not yet unknown, and were working on it. He absorbed this without expression. The officer. No remains, no energy signature consistent with any recorded quirk discharge. The forensic team. His name. The analyst checked her notes. Renji Toda, 23, 8 months post-certification. Endeavor was quiet for a moment. Continue. Hawks waited until the room thinned before moving to Endeavor's side. The live feed showed 3 angles on the street where Beerus and Whis had been for the past 6 hours. One camera had him asleep on the concrete barrier, head tilted. Back arms loose, completely indifferent to the surveillance equipment, the police cordon and the 40-meter exclusion zone the city had built around him over the course of the afternoon. "We're running the wrong playbook," Hawks said. "Everything we know about threat response assumes the target has something it's trying to do, goals we can map, a direction it's moving, something we can get ahead of. And this doesn't. This operates like weather." Hawks kept his eyes on the feed. "The kind that doesn't think about what's underneath it." Endeavor said nothing. He read the name on the incident report again. Renji Toda, 23. "Get me the international line," he said. The room All for One used for this kind of work had no name. Below ground, unremarkable, stocked with equipment that didn't appear on any manifest. He had rooms like it in 4 cities. This was where he thought when thinking needed to be unobserved. He had run the footage 16 times. Not the public clip. The full raw feed from the unit he'd positioned in the area 3 weeks earlier, placed precisely because civil deterioration made surveillance easy and unnoticed. 40 minutes unedited from initial contact through aftermath. He paused on the frame where the suppression array ceased to exist. Not the moment of contact. The moment before. The figure's posture, the angle of the hand, the complete absence of preparation, no stance adjustment, no visible buildup, no tells. Then empty air. He stepped back 3 seconds and let it run again. There was something worth noting about a force that left no physical record of its operation. Every quirk had a mechanism. Even the strangest ones, even the ones that appeared to override physical law, operated within a structure he had spent his life learning to read. He had built himself out of other people's pieces because he understood that structure. He knew how to find the edges of a thing and work at them until they gave. This didn't have edges he could locate. It appeared to exist at a level prior to the architecture he used to think with, which meant the usual methods identify. Replicate, absorb, redirect started from the wrong premise. He noted something else: the protective response had been faster than human visual processing should have allowed. The figure had been tracking the civilians before the facade finished its drop. Behavioral pattern, not reflex. He noted that without assigning it value. Data point. File it. He closed the feed and opened a separate channel. Begin collection on the contact. Environmental readings, behavioral mapping, and I want someone positioned within 300 meters by end of day. A pause. Use Tamura as a variable. See what the contact does when he's in proximity. Turned. Shigaraki heard his name on the open channel and didn't respond immediately. He was in a gutted apartment 4 floors up. One hand resting on the window frame where the glass had mostly gone, watching the gap in the skyline where a building used to be. Not Beerus's work older damage, just another thing the city hadn't finished processing. He had watched the footage once. That was enough. What All for One was doing right now, Shigaraki knew without asking. That particular silence calculating the sound of a very large mechanism beginning to orient. He had grown up inside that silence. He could read its frequency. His own reaction was different, and he didn't need to think hard about why. It wasn't about power. He'd been around powerful things his entire life, and power alone didn't do this to him. What this felt like was older than that. The feeling of being inside a structure that organized itself from the top down and expected you to be small within it. He'd felt it from hero society his whole life. From the ranking system. From every framework that sorted people into sanctioned and disposable and handed out the labels from somewhere above. The purple figure had walked into the middle of all of it and sat down like the categories weren't real. And that was the problem. With a hero, you could expose the gap between what they claimed to protect and what they actually protected. With All for One, you could name the hunger underneath the philosophy. But this thing had no claim to examine, no gap to open up, no philosophy at all. It simply occupied a position above everything he'd ever wanted to bring down, stacked on top of it, and it didn't even notice the things below it enough to justify its position. That was worse than contempt. Contempt required awareness. He pressed 2 fingers against the window frame and let the decay spread 3 centimeters through the plaster before he pulled it back. Old habit. Something to do with the hands. "I heard you," he said to the channel. "Then you understand the assignment. I understand what you want. Good. I didn't say I was going to do it." A pause. Then without inflection, "You're curious about it?" Shigaraki said nothing. "That's fine," All for One said. "Curiosity is a tool. Just keep it aimed correctly." The channel closed. Shigaraki stood at the empty window and thought about what it would feel like to put his hand on something that had decided the rest of the world didn't warrant its attention. Duck, the international call came through the Heroes Public Safety Commission late that night. Brief, formal, the particular weight of a government that had already reached its decision before dialing. The American office confirmed a response unit was being mobilized. The Commission's liaison asked for specifics. The American office said the unit was appropriate to the situation. The liaison asked again. "The unit is appropriate to the situation," the American office said, and thanked them for their cooperation. The line closed. Endeavor read the notification twice, set it on the table, and did not touch it again. Hawks over his shoulder, so the rest of the world noticed. 2 kilometers south on a concrete barrier inside a police cordon that no one had approached for 11 hours. Beerus slept. He had not moved since sundown. He had no particular reason to. The situation, such as it was, had not yet produced anything that required him to be awake. Around him, the city kept moving, not because it wanted to, but because the city was still there, and cities don't stop. Even when something has arrived that none of their systems were designed to account for. The name reached the shelter before she did. Someone had a radio tuned to a frequency that wasn't officially broadcasting anymore. A volunteer coordinator who kept it running out of habit and stubborn hope. The signal came in broken half-static, but the words came through clearly enough. American Response Unit inbound 40 minutes out. And then the name. Star and Stripe. Goto, 3 cots down from the east exit, heard it and sat up straighter. The woman who'd been arguing about whether Beerus had saved or endangered the civilians heard it and went quiet. Even the man who had been cycling through the same grievance since yesterday paused mid-sentence. It was not hope exactly. It was the particular feeling of a last card being placed on the table, the awareness that something large and serious was being committed to a situation that had already consumed everything smaller. Deku heard it from the corridor. He stopped walking for 2 seconds, then kept moving. He had 6 people still waiting on medical referrals, and the east corridor needed clearing before the next shift change. The name meant something was coming. What it meant for what came after, he couldn't calculate yet. She came in low over the bay, at speeds that scrambled 3 different tracking systems before they recalibrated. The feed in the command center caught her at maximum zoom. A contrail at altitude, then nothing. Then she was visible over the harbor flight suit, the cape that the American media had spent years photographing from every angle, the physical presence of someone built to be unmistakable at distance. The room did not cheer. These were people who had been awake for 31 hours, managing a crisis that defied their classification systems. But several of them straightened without meaning to. Hawks watched the feed and felt the shift in the room's barometric pressure. "She's not going to the staging area," he said. Aizawa, beside him, had already noticed. "She's reading the terrain." She made 2 passes over the zone before she descended, not combat approaches, not posturing. She was mapping. Deku had watched enough hero recordings to recognize the pattern she was tracing: evacuation corridors, identifying structural risk zones, clocking civilian density per block. The passes were in intel, not theater. Endeavor had straightened fully by the second pass. Whatever his thoughts were about American intervention on Japanese soil, he kept them behind his teeth. He watched her work, and his face said he recognized the methodology, even if he hadn't chosen to invite it. She landed 4 blocks north of the cordon perimeter, away from the densest population concentration, and she did not approach Beerus immediately. The first thing she did was talk to the evacuation coordinator. "And I need the 3 western blocks cleared in 20 minutes. Her voice carried without effort, not loud projected. The coordinator, a woman who had been running on stimulant patches and institutional stubbornness since the incident, stared at her for approximately 1 second before pulling up her radio. "We've been trying. I know. I'm going to create space. Your job is to move people through it the moment it opens." Star's eyes tracked the skyline, the cordon markers, the positioning of the surveillance equipment. "I need to know where your highest density holdouts are," the coordinator told her. Star absorbed it without writing anything down, the way people absorb information when their memory is good enough that notation would only slow them down. Deku reached the edge of the cleared zone just as she finished. He had a family of 4 with him. 2 adults, 2 children under 6 found in a stairwell, 2 buildings north. He moved them to the coordinator's position and stayed. Star glanced at him. He got the sense she'd already registered him on the second pass and had simply filed the information for when it became relevant. "Midoriya," she said. "Not a question." "Yes." "Stay north of the green line. When the western corridor opens, take anyone your team can carry." A pause, a fraction of a second, the kind that held the weight of what she wasn't saying. "Don't come south of the cordon for any reason." "Understood." He started to add something. She had already turned away. "Yeah." She came over the cordon line at a measured altitude, and the air changed. Not metaphorically. The actual air, its pressure, its movement, its relationship to the objects inside it, shifted as she moved. New order operating at distance, she had declared the rules for the space she was entering, and the space was complying. Wind patterns redirected. Debris on the ground stilled. The operational radius of her quirk pressed outward in a hemisphere that encompassed 4 city blocks and began reorganizing the physical properties of the environment to slow any explosion of force. Constrained dispersal patterns limit the radius of damage from a discharge she hadn't initiated yet and might not need to. In the command center, the tactical analyst pulled up her assessment read and stopped talking. The feed showed what new order looked like at scale, not a beam, not an impact, not an event you could timestamp. A reorganization. The urban terrain becoming less dangerous systematically, the way a room becomes less dangerous when someone methodical walks through it and removes the things that could hurt you. Beerus opened one eye. He had been asleep, or something that served the same function. The distinction was academic. What wasn't academic was that the air pressure across the exclusion zone had shifted measurably. And the shift had a direction and a source, and both of those were new. He sat up. Withstanding a few meters to his right, observed Star's approach with the manner of someone watching an impressive clockwork mechanism. "She's quite methodical," he said. Beerus said nothing. He was watching her altitude, her approach vector, the way she was adjusting the operational parameters of the space between them, without coming closer. He recognized tactic. Not combat tactic, the blunt instrument kind. Strategic tactic. She was changing the terrain before committing, which meant she understood that committing without preparation was wasteful. He found this marginally less irritating than everything else that had happened in this city. She stopped 30 meters out and held her position. "I'm not here to escalate." Her voice was flat and clear, and carried none of the performative affect that heroes sometimes layered onto confrontation. "I'm here because you're in the middle of a civilian population center, and people are dying in the surrounding area. I'm asking you to relocate." Beerus looked at her for a moment. "You're asking?" "Yes. And if I don't, then I'll work around you. No hesitation. That's what this..." A slight motion of her hand indicating the reorganized airspace, the redirected wind, the altered conditions is for. "You're not my objective. Getting people out is." Beerus was quiet for a long moment. Then, "The noodles here were mediocre anyway." He stood up. Not to comply, the distinction was important, and she read it correctly, her posture not relaxing even slightly. He stood up because he had been sitting for 11 hours, and his back was bothering him. And also because something about this particular conversation was slightly less tedious than the ones that had preceded it. "You're different from the others," he said. "Not a compliment, an observation. I have a different job than the others." She shifted her weight, incrementally redistributing, preparing. "I'm the one they send when the other options didn't work." She moved first, not at him. Laterally, a long arc that took her across the western sector New Order, extending ahead of her, rerouting the physical conditions of the urban space. A building's structural stress points temporarily redistributed, a gas main below the street. Pressure locked against rupture, 3 routes of potential collapse, redirected away from the evacuation corridor she was opening in real time. Behind her, the western blocks began to breathe. The coordinator's voice on the radio jumped 2 octaves. Deku ran. He had the family of 4 plus 11 more people he'd gathered on the way. He moved them through the corridor that hadn't existed 4 minutes ago, and behind him, he could see more groups emerging from doorways, from stairwells, from places they'd been trapped in since yesterday. Star wasn't fighting Beerus. She was dismantling the hostage condition of the terrain block by block, using a quirk that let her rewrite the rules of physical space. In 12 minutes, she moved 43,000 people out of the direct impact radius. Beerus watched this with his arms at his sides, and something in his manner that was not quite curiosity and not quite impatience. He tracked her movement, the efficiency of it, the way she was using the space rather than fighting for it. Then she turned toward him. The arc of New Order shifted direction. She was done with the terrain. She was committing now, and they both knew it. She declared her first rule: the distance between them would not decrease below 20 meters without her consent. The air in that radius, compressed, hardened, became a constraint that would have held anything in the world she had grown up in. Anything that operated by the rules she had spent her life learning. Beerus took 1 step forward. The rule held for approximately half a second, long enough that she felt it working, long enough that in the command center someone said, "It's doing something," with audible disbelief. And then it didn't. Not broken. Not overwhelmed. Dissolved the way a rule dissolves when the thing you've applied it to doesn't share the premise the rule was built on. The compression vanished, and the space was just space again, and Beerus was 19 meters away. Star recalibrated in less than a second. She shifted the declaration, not distance, but mass, applying New Order to the ground beneath him, declaring that the surface would provide resistance to forward movement. The ground resisted him for 2 steps. Then it didn't. She tried 4 more applications in the next 90 seconds. Each one faster than the last, each one more laterally creative than simple containment. Atmospheric density, gravitational coefficient within a defined radius. The coefficient of friction on every surface within her operational range. Each rule took hold. Each rule held just long enough to confirm it had worked before it stopped working, not because Beerus broke them. Because he existed at a level where the rules didn't have jurisdiction. She understood this at the fourth attempt. Her approach shifted. She stopped trying to constrain and started using New Order purely offensively, driving concussive force into focused applications, massive and precise. The kind of strikes that rewrote the impact physics of whatever she hit. The first one connected. Beerus moved 3 centimeters. He regarded her with something that required no translation that was something. Then he raised one hand. She hit the ground 4 blocks north. Not dead. The landing had the quality of someone who had trained for impacts their entire career and knew exactly how to distribute force across a body that could take it. She was on one knee. Before the dust settled, one hand on the ground, breathing with the controlled cadence of someone running damage assessment in real time. The command center had gone the same flavor of silent that it had gone the night Renji Toda disappeared from a sidewalk. Different, though. That silence had been the silence of people who had not understood what they were watching. This was the silence of people who had understood completely. Deku was at the northern staging area with the last group from the western corridor. He had 61 people around him. He turned toward the dust plume from Star's impact and stood very still for a moment, calculating nothing, because there was nothing left to calculate. In an apartment 4 floors above ground level, a channel opened. Interesting, All for One said. Shigaraki said nothing. He was watching the dust settle from a different window than yesterday, having moved twice in the past day out of habit. His right hand rested loose at his side, the decay at his fingertips quiet. He had watched all of it. The arc passes. The 43,000 people moved in 12 minutes. The 4 attempts, the 3 centimeters. What he felt was not what All for One felt, and he had stopped pretending otherwise. All for One was cataloging the failed applications. The pattern of dissolution. Something to reverse engineer, to model, to eventually find an angle on. What Shigaraki felt was simpler and worse. He had just watched the most powerful human being alive throw everything she had at something that found it mildly noteworthy. He pressed his thumb against the windowsill. The decay spread 2 centimeters and stopped. "What do you want to do now?" he asked the open channel. "Now." All for One said, "We stop watching." South of the cordon, Beerus lowered his hand. He looked at the place where Star had been standing, and then at the dust, still hanging in the air 4 blocks north, and then at the evacuation corridor she had carved through the western zone. Empty now, but the shape of it still visible in the redirected debris patterns. The opened routes, the 43,000 people who were somewhere safer than they had been an hour ago because she had used her 12 minutes correctly. "Whis," he said. "Yes, Lord Beerus." She was worth watching. Whis considered this. "High praise." "It wasn't praise," Beerus said. "It was an observation." He sat back down on the concrete barrier. His back still bothered him. The air was cleaner now. The evacuation corridor had removed a significant portion of the ambient noise he'd found irritating since arriving, and the city, in a small and localized way, was less of a problem than it had been an hour ago. None of this changed anything fundamental, but he noted it. In the staging area to the north, Deku turned away from the dust plume. He had 61 people who needed to be registered, assessed, and moved to secondary shelter before nightfall. He started doing that. He didn't speak. There wasn't anything to say that the last hour hadn't already said more clearly. The world had put its best answer to the question on the table. The question was still there. The military jets appeared over the bay at dawn. Not 1. 7 in a formation that wasn't aggressive and wasn't reassuring the arrangement of assets that said we are here and we are undecided. 3 different national markings. The Heroes Public Safety Commission had been informed. They had not been consulted. Deku watched them from the roof of the secondary staging area where he had been since well before sunrise, helping process the last wave of Western Zone evacuees. 61 people the night before. 412 since Star's corridor opened. The number kept revising upward as teams found holdouts in buildings that hadn't been on any assessment list. He was past the point where the body registers fatigue as a complaint, so far past it that the whole condition had stopped feeling like anything and become simply the baseline of existing. He watched the jets and thought about what they represented, and then went back inside because there were still people who needed processing, and thinking about what the jets represented wasn't going to help them. Hawks found him 20 minutes later. "Commission is in emergency session." Hawks kept his voice low, though the noise level in the staging area made discretion mostly academic. 3 proposals on the table. One of them involves ordnance. Deku set down the intake form he'd been filling out. What kind? The kind that requires evacuating a 12-kilometer radius first. Hawks read his face. "Yeah, that's where we are." "Would it work?" The pause before Hawks answered was its own answer. "It would make a very large noise. Whether that constitutes working depends on your definition." Deku picked the form back up. "What does Endeavor say?" "Endeavor said, if anyone fires anything at that target without his knowledge, he'll consider it an attack on the rescue operation and respond accordingly." A beat. He said it very quietly. That was the scariest version. Outside, the formation completed its holding pattern and began a second circuit. Same arrangement, still undecided. Star and Stripe had been moved to a medical facility in the northern zone 12 hours earlier. She was ambulatory. The impact assessment had come back with numbers that the attending physicians kept rereading because the numbers didn't match the mechanism of injury they'd observed. A human body should not survive what the surveillance records showed. Hers had, because hers was not a standard human body, and because she had spent 20 years learning exactly how to fall. She had asked for a full debrief within 2 hours of regaining full consciousness. The commission liaison who came to conduct it was not prepared for her to be sitting upright, drinking water, and ready to give a systematic account of each new order application and its result. She went through all 6 attempts, what she'd tried, what had happened, the duration of each effect before dissolution, her assessment of why. "It's not that the quirk failed," she said. "The quirk worked exactly the way it always works. The problem is that the target isn't a thing the quirk can address. New order operates on physical reality. It rewrites the rules of objects and phenomena within this world's physical framework." She set down the water. "That thing isn't inside this world's physical framework. Applying new order to it is like trying to legislate something that isn't subject to your jurisdiction. The law functions perfectly. It just doesn't reach." The liaison wrote this down. His pen moved very carefully, the way people write when they're recording something they don't want to have to explain to anyone else later. "Your recommendation," he said. "Evacuation, as wide as you can manage." She looked at the ceiling. "And stop trying to fight it. Every attempt to contain it is making the situation worse because every attempt gives it a reason to react. We can't simply—" "I know." Her voice didn't change. "I'm not telling you what's politically possible. I'm telling you what I observed." 2 kilometers from the cordon, in a building cleared for structural hazard and subsequently occupied anyway. All for One's collection team had been running since the early hours of the morning. The equipment was specialized and unregistered, designed to measure phenomena that standard hero support technology wasn't built to detect. Energy output at rest, spatial distortion in proximity, any detectable variance in local physical constants within the subject's immediate radius. The readings were in the technical language of the analyst running them anomalous, in the way that meant the equipment was functioning correctly and the universe was not. All for One reviewed the preliminary data from his secondary location and found it consistent with his working hypothesis. Whatever Beerus was, he wasn't operating through a mechanism that could be measured with tools calibrated to quirk-based phenomena, which meant the standard approach: identify the mechanism, find the edges, apply pressure at the margins, needed to be set aside. He had a different angle. He opened a line to the 3 units he'd positioned in the eastern evacuation zone, not near Beerus, away from him. In the gaps between rescue operations, in the spaces where the hero presence was thinnest. "Begin the secondary operation," he said. "Staged. I want reactions, not results." The first attack hit a relief convoy mid-morning. Not Nomu, something more calculated. A coordinated strike on 3 vehicles, simultaneously timed to occur at a junction where hero response would be split between the convoy and a secondary disturbance 2 blocks north. The strike was clean fast and left enough survivors to confirm it had been deliberate. The secondary disturbance was a structural collapse induced in a building 3 blocks from the nearest evacuation route. Deku was already running before the alert finished transmitting. He wasn't the only one. The response was immediate and distributed, hawks pulling South Aizawa, redirecting 2 nearby teams. Todoroki moving to intercept the structural collapse with the controlled efficiency of someone who had stopped feeling surprised by anything this city produced. The coordination was good, the coverage was adequate, and it left the northern observation perimeter with 40% fewer personnel than it had started the morning with. Deku reached the convoy site in 90 seconds, found 4 injured and 2 critically so, and began field triage with the controlled focus that had become his resting mode over the past 72 hours. He was aware in the back of his mind of the secondary collapse. The perimeter gap, the way the 2 incidents were spaced and timed in a pattern that felt designed rather than coincidental. He filed that awareness and kept working because the person in front of him was bleeding, and the awareness wasn't useful until the immediate problem was handled. The immediate problem took 11 minutes. By the time he looked up, the gap had been open for 9 of them. Shigaraki moved through it on foot. No floating hands, no identifying gear. Dark clothing hood, up the posture of someone who had spent years being not noticed in environments that would have been hostile if they'd paid attention. The evacuation of the Western Zone had left entire blocks in a state that was navigable if you knew how to read abandoned urban space, which he did. He wasn't following All for One's plan. All for One's plan involved positioning data collection controlled escalation. It was a good plan. The kind of person who thought in systems and leverage points and long arcs of consequence would design. Shigaraki didn't care about the plan. He wanted to see it, not the feed, not the processed output of someone else's equipment. He wanted to stand in proximity to the thing that had made New Order dissolve, and the world's most powerful hero look like a structural problem that had sorted itself out, and he wanted to understand what that felt like from close range. He came around the corner of a collapsed retail frontage and stopped. The cordon was 50 meters ahead. Beyond it, the concrete barrier. On the barrier, Beerus, awake this time, sitting with his forearms on his knees, looking at nothing in particular, or looking at everything without assigning any of its special significance, which from the outside produced the same appearance. The exclusion zone was empty. The surveillance equipment at the perimeter hummed at a frequency Shigaraki could feel in his back teeth. He stood there for a moment and felt something he hadn't expected. Not fear. Shigaraki had a complicated relationship with fear that had been developing since he was 5 years old, and what he felt now wasn't that. It was closer to the vertigo of standing at the edge of something with no bottom. Not the danger of falling, but the fact of the depth. The thing on the barrier had no ideology, no grudge, no system it wanted to replace with a better one. It had no interest in whether hero society stood or fell because it had no interest in the scale at which those distinctions operated. It existed at a level where the question of who held power in one country on one planet was the kind of detail you noticed the way you noticed the color of a pebble. Shigaraki had spent years wanting to tear down everything that stood above him. This thing didn't stand above him. It existed in a register where above and below weren't applicable categories. He pressed 2 fingers against the concrete pillar beside him and let the decay run. It spread in a gray network through the material, moving faster than usual. He was irritated, and the quirk responded to that until it had consumed the pillar from the base up in a slow fractal pattern. Beerus turned his head. Not toward the perimeter equipment, not toward the cordon. Directly at Shigaraki's position, through 50 meters of empty space and the partial cover of the collapsed frontage with the immediate accuracy of something that didn't need to search for what had caught its attention. Shigaraki went very still. The eye contact lasted approximately 3 seconds. Then Beerus looked away. Not dismissive, not threatened. The quality of someone who had registered a variable and determined it didn't require immediate action. The most dangerous possible response, because it meant the variable had been filed. Shigaraki pulled back from the pillar. His hand was shaking slightly, and he wasn't sure when that had started. His phone vibrated. All for one's line. You moved without authorization. I went for a walk. You were seen. I know. Shigaraki looked at his own fingers. The decay had stopped when he pulled back, leaving the pillar half consumed in gray, crumbling lattice. It looked at me. A pause. And nothing. He pulled his hood down and turned away from the cordon. It put me somewhere. I don't know what the somewhere is. That's useful data. Stop calling it data. The irritation in his voice came out sharper than intended. It's not running experiments. It just noticed me and decided I wasn't worth reacting to. And that's more unsettling than if it had tried to kill me. The line was quiet for a moment. Come back, All for One said. I have another use for you. Shigaraki walked back through the gap in the perimeter, past the half-eaten pillar, and did not look behind him. Beerus watched the white-haired figure disappear back into the evacuation zone and returned his attention to the jets, still circling overhead. 7 since dawn. They kept their distance with the careful consistency of things that were frightened but committed to not showing it. He found them less irritating than the ground-level situation. At altitude, at least they were quiet. Whis, he said. Yes, Lord Beerus. How many people are still in this city? Whis considered the question. The evacuation is approximately 60% complete. The remainder are concentrated in the northern and eastern sectors. Perhaps 300,000. And they're staying because nowhere to go, mostly. The secondary shelter network is at capacity. Beerus looked at the circling formation, at the cordon equipment, at the surveillance drones documenting his existence in rotating shifts since the first night, at the accumulated infrastructure of a civilization, trying to manage something that had walked into its operational territory and sat down without asking permission. This city, son, he said, has too many layers. It's had a difficult few years. Everything has had a difficult few years. He leaned back regarding the jets with something that lived in the vicinity of contempt but hadn't fully committed. And it keeps adding problems instead of removing the ones it already has. In the eastern evacuation zone, a second alert pinged across the Hero network, another coordinated strike, same design as the morning. Different location. Same deliberate gap generation logic. Deku was already moving. Around him, the city was doing what cities do when the load exceeds the structure, not collapsing. Not holding, but pushing stress toward wherever the frame was thinnest. 300,000 people, 7 jets, 43,000 moved by a woman currently giving a methodical debrief from a hospital bed. A white-haired figure who had stood at the edge of a cordon and then walked away with shaking hands. Beerus watched the new drone arrive to replace the one whose battery had depleted, taking its position in the rotation with mechanical fidelity. He tracked it for a moment. Whis. Yes? How long has it been? Since we arrived, approximately 63 hours. Beerus said nothing for a while. The jets circled. The drones hummed. In the distance, the sound of another alert, another running response, another layer of managed crisis settling over the layers already there. This city, he said finally, is testing my patience. Was noted the shift in register, the small but meaningful distance between irritated and whatever occupied the next position along that scale. He watched the formation complete another circuit and said nothing. In a gutted building, 4 floors above the street, a line opened. Tonight, All for One said, we stopped being careful. The operation began just before midnight. Not one thing. 4 things simultaneously, which was the point. All for One's secondary units hit the eastern relay stations, the communication infrastructure that routed hero dispatch across the northern and eastern zones. Not destroyed. Disrupted selectively in a pattern that left emergency frequencies intact while severing the coordination layer. Heroes could still respond to individual calls. They could not route response across sectors. At the same moment, 3 Nomu-class assets activated in the shelter network. Not the most powerful variants. The most disruptive, built for crowd panic, for structural damage to enclosed spaces, for the kind of chaos that turns a managed evacuation into a collapse. The shelters had been the one stable thing in the northern zone for 4 days. The 4th element was Shigaraki. All for One had given him a position and a timing window and a clear operational purpose. Shigaraki had agreed to all of it and then done something adjacent but not identical because that was who he was, and All for One had factored that in, and neither of them had discussed this openly. Shelter 7 went loud 2 minutes later. Deku was in the eastern corridor when the Nomu came through the gymnasium wall. Not a clean breach. It tore the structural frame, and the ceiling section above cots 30 through 47 cracked and began to separate. He was moving before the dust hit him. Black Whip already deploying, threading through the collapsing section to reach the people underneath. He pulled 6 people clear in 90 seconds. The 7th was a man whose leg was pinned under a support beam that weighed more than Deku could safely move without risking secondary collapse on the other 4 people still trapped in the section. He did the math in under 2 seconds and shifted the beam at an angle that transferred the load to 2 more stable uprights. Took the impact of the partial secondary collapse on his own back and got the man out. His left shoulder made a sound it shouldn't have made. He noted this and kept moving. There were still 4 more people in the section, and the ceiling was still coming down. Outside, the night had changed texture. The cordon had been quiet for 63 hours. Less than 5 minutes into the operation, it stopped being quiet. The disruption came from the east. First, the coordination blackout registered as a sudden drop in radio traffic across 6 frequencies. Simultaneously, the silence of infrastructure that has been removed rather than failed. Endeavor was in the command vehicle when it hit. He had the doors open and was issuing orders before the duty analyst finished her first sentence. "Shelter network," he said. "All units drop the cordon perimeter and move to shelter response. Now." "Sir, the target." "The target hasn't moved in 3 days. The shelters are moving right now. Go." The perimeter thinned in under 4 minutes. 38 heroes pulling east and north toward the shelter, strikes toward the coordination gap, toward the places where 300,000 people were in enclosed spaces with things designed to cause maximum panic. Hawks was airborne before the order finished transmitting. He took the elevation and read the city the way he read cities, not as a map, as a system of pressures. Where were people moving? Where were they stuck? Where did the pressure exceed the container? The eastern zone was lighting up in ways that had pattern to them, which meant design, which meant someone had timed this against the perimeter drawdown, which meant endeavor. His voice on the frequency was very level. The shelter strikes and the coordination cut happened at the same time the cordon thinned. This isn't a raid. It's a redirect. A pause. Then, redirect toward what? Hawks looked south toward the exclusion zone, toward the concrete barrier and the figure that had been sitting on it for 3 days. "I don't know yet," he said. "But move people away from the southern sector. Whatever's about to happen down there, don't let civilians be in it." Beerus was awake. He had been awake since the operation started, which was when the first coordinated pressure change reached him not through any information network, but through the simple fact of being a thing, with senses calibrated to cosmological scales, for whom the local reorganization of a city's stress patterns registered the way a change in wind registers to someone who has spent a long time paying attention to weather. Something had shifted. He stood up from the barrier for the first time in hours and looked east, where the shelter network was, and then looked at the half-emptied cordon perimeter, and then looked at Whis. Whis had his staff held loosely, his weight balanced in the way it never was when he was fully at ease. "The chaos is deliberate," Beerus said. "It appears so. Someone is using these people." He said it without particular inflection, the way you state a condition of the environment. "As distraction. That would be consistent with what I'm observing, yes." Beerus looked at the city. At the lights shifting in the eastern zone, the helicopter beams the distant sound of structural failure and crowd movement mixing into the particular frequency of mass panic. At the drones that were still circling thinner, now most of them redirected east, at the perimeter that had gone from 40 heroes to 11 in 4 minutes. "And the reason they're doing this," he said, "is to get close to me. That also seems consistent. Using 300,000 civilians as cover so that someone can approach me." A pause. "Yes," Whis said. Beerus was quiet for approximately 4 seconds. Shigaraki came over the southern perimeter not long after. Not cautious this time. Not the careful, not noticed movement of his earlier approach. He came in directly because direct was what the moment called for, and because the 11 remaining perimeter heroes had their hands full with evacuation routing and wouldn't engage him unless he gave them cause. He didn't give them cause. He moved through the exclusion zone with his hands at his sides. Decay contained, hood down, and he stopped 20 meters from the concrete barrier and looked at Beerus. Beerus looked back at him. "You came back," Beerus said. "Yeah." "The chaos to the east." He tilted his head slightly. "That's yours." "Not mine." Shigaraki's voice was flat. "Someone else's plan. I'm here for a different reason." "What reason?" Shigaraki thought about how to answer this and then didn't bother packaging it. "I want to know what it feels like. To be something that can't be pulled down." Beerus regarded him with the attention he gave to things that were marginally more interesting than the baseline. "You've been trying to pull things down your whole life. Everything I've ever tried to destroy was made of the same stuff as me. Rules, systems, people who decided they got to be above other people." A pause. You're not made of any of that. No, Beerus agreed. So I want to know if that means you can't be brought down, or if it means I've been destroying the wrong things. The exclusion zone was very quiet. The noise from the east reached them as a low, continuous register, distant and total the sound of a city under pressure. Beerus tilted his head the other direction. That's a more interesting question than I expected from you. I didn't come here to be interesting. No. You came here because you couldn't stay away. He stood up fully. That's different. The Nomu that came through the southern perimeter wall came without warning. It was all for one's contingency, a variant positioned in the abandoned industrial block south of the exclusion zone for 48 hours, held on standby, activated remotely the moment all for one sensors confirmed Shigaraki had made direct contact with the target. Not to fight Beerus, to collect. Equipped with absorption hardware, atmospheric sampling, the kind of equipment that needed to be within 10 meters of a subject to function. It was large. It moved fast. It came through the wall at full speed toward the concrete barrier, shedding the industrial block's exterior in fragments that scattered across the exclusion zone. 3 of those fragments hit the surveillance array on the southern perimeter. One of them, a piece of structural steel approximately 2 meters long, spinning on a flat trajectory from the impact, passed through the space where 2 evacuation volunteers had been standing outside the southern cordon boundary. They had been there to redirect anyone coming south from Shelter 7. They were not there afterward. The Nomu crossed 12 meters of exclusion zone before it stopped. It stopped because Beerus turned toward it. He raised one hand. The Nomu was gone. Not the theatrical version, no light, no sound, no shockwave. The mass that had been moving across the exclusion zone was simply absent from the space it had been occupying. The air where it had been was undisturbed. The ground underneath it was undisturbed. The debris it had been shedding stopped in midair for a fraction of a second, and then fell because the debris had existed before the Nomu, and continued to exist after, but the Nomu itself had been pulled from the equation, with the finality of something that had never been allowed to matter. Shigaraki watched this from 20 meters away and did not move. The 2 places where the volunteers had been were empty. Beerus looked at them, then at the wall the Nomu had come through, then slowly in the direction of the industrial block the Nomu had been staged in. "Whis," he said. "Yes, Lord Beerus." "Someone put that thing there." "Yes." "Someone put it there and activated it and aimed it through a populated area." He looked at the empty spaces. "And it killed 2 people on its way to me." Whis said nothing. "They used those 2 people," Beerus said, "as acceptable loss, in a plan to collect data on me." The temperature in the exclusion zone did not change. The air did not move. Beerus did not raise his voice or alter his posture in any way that would have registered on any of the remaining surveillance equipment. But Shigaraki, 20 meters away, felt the shift. He had no framework for what it was. Not pressure, not heat, not any sensation he had a name for. It was more like the moment before a very large structure commits fully to falling. Not the fall itself, but the instant of total mechanical inevitability that precedes it. "Enough," Beerus said. He moved east. Not fast by his standards. Unhurried. The kind of pace that meant the destination wasn't going anywhere because the destination had no option but to wait. The first thing he removed was the industrial block where the Nomu had been staged. The building did not collapse. It did not burn. It was present. And then it was not a clean negative space where a 4-story structure had stood, and the people running past it on the evacuation route to the north did not understand for several seconds what they were seeing, because the vocabulary for it didn't exist in any language they'd been taught. The coordination gap. All for One had created worked against itself. Heroes in the Eastern Zone couldn't reach each other to coordinate a response to what was happening in the South. Endeavor got the visual from 3 blocks north and started running anyway. Everyone south of Line 7 moved north. Now, don't stop. He was already on the move, fire building across his shoulders, not for offense, but for the light it threw, because the Eastern Zone had lost power in 2 sectors, and people needed to see where they were going. Hawks. Already on it. Hawks was 60 meters up, reading the crowd flows, directing his feathers in long arcs that pushed stragglers toward open routes. Flagged, blocked passages served as visible markers in the darkness. Southern sector is thinning. Keep pushing. The second thing Beerus removed was a structure that had served as a coordination point for 3 of All for One's secondary units, not the units themselves, most of whom had dispersed, but the building, and with it the equipment that had been disrupting the hero frequency network. Radio traffic surged back across 4 channels simultaneously as the interference source vanished. The third thing was harder to describe. There was a section of the Eastern Zone, 2 blocks densely built, that had become a convergence point for the Nomu-driven crowd panic and 2 separate villain incursions. The hero presence there was thin. The civilian density was not. It had been building toward a pressure failure, the kind of crowd dynamic that kills people not through violence, but through the physics of mass panic in enclosed spaces. Beerus looked at it for a moment. Then he removed the 2 structures that were creating the convergence. Not the people, the structures. The buildings that were channeling the crowd into the pressure point were gone. And the pressure point ceased to be a pressure point because there was now open space where the walls had been, and the crowd dispersed into it, because crowds given space will use it. In the command vehicle, the tactical display updated with a lag of approximately 6 seconds. The analyst stared at it. "Is that?" She stopped. "Yeah," said the officer beside her. Neither of them said anything else. Deku was at the northern edge of Shelter 7's collapse zone with a woman and her 2 children when the buildings came down in the east. He felt it before he saw it, a change in the air, a quality of absence spreading from the south and east, the hush that follows the removal of large amounts of sound-producing mass from an environment. He looked up. Where 2 buildings had been there was sky. He looked at the sky for 1 second. 2. Then the woman said something, and he looked at her and her children and picked up the smaller one because she couldn't run fast enough, and he ran. He ran because that was the job. Not the job of understanding what was happening south of him. Not the job of finding a way to stop it. Not the job of standing in the path of something that operated at a scale he didn't have instruments to measure. The job was the woman, the children, the 40 meters to the next safe zone, the people still in Shelter 7 who needed someone to run back in and get them. He ran, and he did not look south again. Because there was nothing useful he could do by looking, and there was something useful he could do by running, and that was the only calculation that mattered right now. Bakugo found him 20 minutes later at the secondary staging point, covered in concrete dust. 3 cracked ribs from the shelter collapse in the process of organizing a sweep team for the Shelter 7 remnants. "How many still inside?" Bakugo said. "Last count, maybe 30. "Then stop standing here." Deku looked at him for half a second. Bakugo's right gauntlet was damaged, his costume torn across the shoulder. And he had been operating in the Eastern Zone since the coordination blackout hit, which meant he had been running rescue operations alone in the dark for over an hour. "Yeah," Deku said. "Let's go." In the building 4 floors above the street, a different building now, because Shigaraki had moved and All for One's teams had repositioned twice during the night. A feed showed the tactical display in real time. The 2 missing structures in the Eastern Zone. The clean negative space where the industrial block had been. The crowds moving through the opened areas with the quality of people who do not understand why they have room to move, but are moving anyway. All for One was watching it. Shigaraki was not in the building. He had not come back after the exclusion zone. All for One's position tracker showed him stationary 400 meters north in a location that was not a tactical position by any measure. All for One looked at the data from the collection Nomu. Before it had been removed, the 4 seconds of proximity readings it had managed before the operation ended. 4 seconds of data. He studied it. The numbers were anomalous in a way that confirmed his hypothesis and extended it considerably further than he had initially calculated. This was not a quirk phenomenon. This was not something adjacent to a quirk phenomenon. This was something that had no relationship to the axis on which quirk phenomena existed, which meant every model he had built over the course of his life, every framework for understanding, acquiring, and applying power, was operating at the wrong level of analysis. He set the data down and sat for a while in the dark. Outside, the city was still moving, still redistributing its load, still trying to manage a situation that had stopped being manageable on the second day, and had been running on institutional inertia and individual heroism since then. Beerus had not returned to the concrete barrier. He was somewhere in the eastern zone, and the eastern zone was getting quieter. All for One thought about what Shigaraki had said relayed through the open channel before he'd cut it. It noticed me. It put me somewhere. He thought about what that meant for his own position in the taxonomy of this situation. Then he thought about Tomura stationary, 400 meters north, not responding to contact. "We need to revise the timeline," he said to the empty room. "And we need to have a conversation about what Tomura is going to do next." No one answered, because there was no one there. The eastern zone continued to go quiet sector by sector in the direction of something moving through it. The eastern zone had gone quiet in the wrong way, not the quiet of evacuation completed, not the quiet of a situation resolved, the quiet of a city that had stopped making noise because enough of it was gone, and what remained had learned that sound attracted attention. Deku had been running for 4 hours without stopping in any meaningful sense. Pausing counted only as a different form of moving one that involved assessing rather than carrying. His left shoulder had been taped by a field medic somewhere around the 2nd hour. The tape was already failing. He had stopped noticing the shoulder sometime after that. Bakugo had split off north 20 minutes ago with a sweep team. Todoroki was anchoring the eastern corridor where the building removal had opened a gap that kept collapsing under foot traffic. Aizawa had pulled back to the secondary command point, not retreat the clinical repositioning of someone who understood that coordination from a stable node saved more people than running himself into the ground at the front. Deku was at the front. He was always at the front. Not because it was tactically optimal, because somewhere between the first shelter collapse and the current moment he had stopped being able to make himself not be. The building ahead of him had been flagged yellow before the night started. It was something else now, still standing, technically the way a thing is still standing when it has lost faith in the project but hasn't fully committed to falling. 3 floors. Southeast corner compromised. The surveillance report from 2 hours ago had listed it as unoccupied. He could hear someone inside. He went in through the ground floor window because the door frame had warped and wouldn't open. The interior was dark in the way that post-power buildings were dark. Not complete thin lines of light from structural gaps enough to move by if you'd trained for it, which he had. He moved through the ground floor fast and found the stairwell intact and went up. 2nd floor clear. Evidence of recent occupation, a blanket, a bag food packaging, but no one. 3rd floor, the southeast corner had partially given way. The floor tilted at an angle that made walking require attention. At the far end where the wall had cracked open to show a thin wedge of gray pre-dawn sky, there was a man. 50s heavy coat sitting against the damaged wall with his arms around his knees, not unconscious, not injured in any obvious way. "Just not leaving." Deku crossed the tilted floor, tested each step, reached him. "I need you to come with me." The man looked up. His eyes were focused. He wasn't in shock. He had made a decision about staying, and he hadn't made it stupidly. "My wife was in this building," the man said. "Before." Deku absorbed this. Before the war. Before a lot of things. He looked at his hands. "I know she isn't here. I'm not confused about that. I just couldn't be anywhere else tonight." The floor shifted. Not collapse, a small seismic complaint from the southeast corner, the building restating its structural opinion on the situation. "I understand," Deku said, which was true in the way that things are true when you don't have time to fully explain how they're true. "But this building is going to make a decision in the next few hours, and I need you somewhere else before it does. Will you come?" The man looked at him for a moment. At the costume, at the taped shoulder, at whatever was visible in Deku's face after 4 hours of this. "You look terrible," the man said. "I know. How many times have you done this tonight?" "I stopped counting." The man stood up. His knees were bad. Deku took his arm without being asked, and they crossed the tilted floor together, and they went down the stairs that were still there, and they came out through the warped door frame that Deku held open with his back against it, and they were outside. The man stood in the pre-dawn gray and looked at the building he'd been sitting in, and then at Deku. "Thank you," he said. Deku nodded and turned east because east was where the next call had come from, and he was already moving. Endeavor had stopped trying to think in terms of victory approximately 6 hours ago. The shift had not been dramatic. There had been no moment of decision, no explicit acknowledgement. It had arrived the way most honest reckonings arrive, quietly, in the space between one action and the next, as a simple change in the question he was asking himself. Not "how do we end this?" Now "who can we keep?" The difference was enormous and also invisible from outside. He was holding the southern triage corridor with 2 heroes he didn't know well and a volunteer team that had been running on nothing but momentum for hours. The corridor existed because the 2 removals in the eastern zone had opened a gap in the crowd pressure, and if someone didn't hold the shape of that gap, the crowd would fill it wrong and the root would collapse. So he held it, not with fire, not a fence, not the prominence burn that was his signature and his limit. He held it the way a wall holds a building, by being a thing that did not move when things pressed against it. He redirected. He absorbed. He said very few words because the situation had stopped being the kind that improved with words. Hawks came in from altitude and landed beside him for 30 seconds. "Northern route is holding," Hawks said. "Aizawa's got the command node. Bakugo is pulling people out of the gap zone. Midoriya, still going?" A pause. "I've been tracking him. He's not stopping." Endeavor looked north, where the gap subzone was, where the pre-dawn darkness still had movement in it, people and the shapes of people, and the particular heat signatures of people doing things in the dark. "Tell him to rotate," Endeavor said. "I've told him twice." "Tell him again." Endeavor. Hawks's voice had the quality it got when he was about to say something he'd rather not. He knows. He just can't. Endeavor understood this in the specific way that a person understands something they've seen in themselves and eliminated through years of controlled self-revision. He let it sit. "Keep the northern route, Sam," he said. Hawks went back up. Shigaraki was standing at the edge of what had been the industrial block, the negative space, and was difficult to look at directly. Not because of anything visual, the absence itself was clean, the edges of surrounding structures undamaged. It was difficult because the mind kept trying to fill it in, kept reaching for the information that should be there, and finding nothing, kept cycling back to try again. Like a tongue finding a missing tooth. He had been standing here for 40 minutes. All for One had contacted him 3 times. He had answered once briefly and let the other 2 go. He pressed his heel against the ground at the edge of the absent space and felt the concrete under his boot and thought about the conversation in the exclusion zone. The question he had asked Beerus. Can't be brought down or wrong things destroyed. Beerus had not answered it. He had said Shigaraki's coming back was a different thing than he'd described it as, which was not an answer and was also more than an answer, and Shigaraki had been turning it over ever since. All for One's fourth contact came in. He let it go again. The logic he'd grown up inside. All for One's logic, the logic of leverage and acquisition and the long game, had a shape. He understood the shape. He'd been swimming in it so long, he could feel its currents before they moved. And the shape was telling him, Beerus is a variable to be exploited. The chaos is an opportunity. The disintegration of the hero system is the outcome we've been working toward. Shigaraki looked at the missing block and thought, but the hero system isn't disintegrating because of anything we did. It's disintegrating because something walked in that makes the entire category irrelevant. Heroes and villains, and the war between them, and everything that shaped him since he was 5 years old. All of it had just been revealed as a local argument in a very small room. He didn't know what to do with that. He didn't know how to be angry at Beerus the way he knew how to be angry at everything else. The system gave him something to push against. The structure gave him something to crack. Beerus gave him nothing. Hating Beerus was like hating altitude, and All for One wanted to use it. The fifth contact. This time he answered. You've been thinking, All for One said. Yeah? And I'm not going to do what you want me to do next. A pause that was longer than All for One's pauses usually were. What do you think I want? You want me to run your proximity operation while you run the collection play from cover. You want me as the variable in the front and yourself as the analyst in the back. Shigaraki kept his voice very flat. Same as it's always been. And you object to this now. I've always objected to this. He looked at the missing block. I just didn't say it. Tomura. I'm going to go find him myself. Silence. That All for One said would be extremely unwise. Probably. Shigaraki turned away from the absent space and looked north toward the exclusion zone, toward the area where something that couldn't be classified as villain or hero or anything with a name had been passing through the eastern zone and leaving quiet behind it. But it'll be mine. He cut the contact. All for One in the building that was not the building he'd been in. 6 hours ago, he had moved twice, would move again before dawn, sat with the open frequency in thought. He had planned for Tomura's resistance. He had not fully planned for Tomura's clarity. The distinction was meaningful. Resistance could be redirected. Clarity had to be waited out or removed. He opened a different channel. One he hadn't used since before the war. Begin the final positioning, he said. Not yet, but be ready. The woman was under a collapsed interior wall, first floor of a building 2 blocks north of the gap zone. She was conscious. Her left leg was pinned, and she had been there long enough to understand her situation completely, which was worse in some ways than not understanding it. She had been calling out intermittently, and had stopped sometime in the last hour because calling out had stopped producing results. Deku found her because he had gone through the building systematically. And she was in the last room he checked, which was always where people were. He assessed the wall section in 4 seconds. Too heavy for him to lift clean without bracing, and there was nothing stable to brace against in the right position. He could shift it if he accepted that the shift would produce a secondary drop from the ceiling section above, and the secondary drop would come down on him. He did the math. I'm going to move this, he said. When it comes off your leg, I need you to pull yourself toward the door. Don't wait for me. Just go. What about you? I'll be right behind you. He positioned himself, activated Fa Jin, and lifted. The wall moved. The ceiling section dropped. He took it across the upper back, the shoulder that had been taped, made a detailed complaint, and held it long enough for her to drag herself clear. And then he let it go and moved fast in the direction of the door and made it through with the ceiling coming down behind him. They were outside. The woman sat on the ground, breathing, staring at the building. Deku sat next to her for exactly 1 minute, because he had learned that people who had just survived something needed 1 minute of someone next to them before they could function alone. At the 50-second mark, she said, "There are 2 more people in the building across the street." He was already standing. Beerus had not spoken in 2 hours. He had moved through the eastern zone at a pace that was not walking exactly something slower in intent, but covering ground, the way water covers ground, moving around obstacles rather than through them, ending up where it was going to end up, regardless of what was in the way. He had removed 2 more structures. Both had been the kind of thing that made the ambient noise worse. One, a collapsed building acting as a crowd funnel directing panic into a narrowing corridor with no exit to one, a failing elevated section of road that would have dropped on a concentration of civilians within the hour. Both removals had been clean. Both had produced the same response from the surrounding area. The particular silence of people who had stopped being surprised by the vocabulary they lacked. He was aware of the small figure in the green costume, had been aware of it since before the man in the heavy coat. He had been aware of it the way he was aware of things that did something other than what things in this world typically did. Everything in this world, when it encountered the situation, made one of 2 choices: move away from the danger or move toward it with some calculation about gain. The second type was common enough, all for one's type. Interesting only in the way that mechanisms are interesting, which was not very. The green one moved toward the danger, and the gain wasn't there. There was no calculation Beerus could identify, no position being established, no outcome being secured beyond the next 30 seconds. Just someone was going to be hurt, and this person was not able to be somewhere else while that happened. He had watched it do this 12 times in the last 4 hours. He had not interrupted it. The 13th time it came out of a building with a woman who could not walk well, supporting her weight with the arm that clearly hurt to use, and it crossed an open stretch of ground that was within Beerus's immediate radius, 40 meters close enough that the wrongness of his presence should have been legible at a physical level, and it did not slow down. Beerus turned his head. The green one looked up, registered him, made no motion toward fighting, no motion toward retreat, looked at him the way someone looks at a fact they have already accounted for, and kept moving. 10 meters, 5, passed. The woman was deposited at the edge of the safe zone, and then the green one was already turning back. Beerus watched it go. Wiz to his left said nothing. "Whis," Beerus said. "Yes, Lord Beerus, that one." He didn't point. He didn't need to. How many times has it done that? Was checked not because he needed to, because it was a question that deserved a precise answer. 19. In the time since I began counting. And before you began counting, I started counting when I noticed the pattern. Beerus was quiet. In the eastern zone, the pre-dawn light was beginning to give the destruction texture it hadn't had in the dark, the shapes of removed buildings showing as clean edges against the gray sky. The crowds as movement across open ground, the single figure in green already going back into a building that anyone with functioning survival instinct would have declined to enter. This world, Beerus said, produces very strange things. It does, Whis agreed. Not good, not strong, just... He looked at the building, at the dark window where the green figure had gone. Persistent, in a way that makes no sense given the circumstances. Whis chose not to comment on what the tone of that observation was or was not indicating. And Deku came back out with 2 people, an older man and a teenage girl. The girl with a cut across her forehead that had been bleeding long enough to dry the man with the careful movement of cracked ribs. He had them on either side, 1 arm each, and he walked them to the safe zone and delivered them to the medic team, and then he stood for a moment with his hands on his knees. The shoulder was not getting better on its own. He straightened and looked east where the next call marker was, and then he looked south where the pre-dawn light was showing him the shape of the exclusion zone and the figure standing in it. Beerus was looking at him. Deku held that for a moment. The weight of it, the quality of attention from something that had been erasing pieces of the world for hours and had chosen in this specific moment to direct that attention at him. He walked toward the cordon, not through it. He stopped at the barrier and looked across the exclusion zone at Beerus. 20 meters. Enough space to hold a conversation or to not. "Are you going to erase all of it?" Deku said. Not a challenge. A genuine question asked the way you ask a question when you need to know the answer to plan the next hour. Beerus looked at him for a moment. "No, Some of it, yes. Deku thought about this. Which part? The parts that are rotten. The parts that were rotten before I arrived and used everything else as a reason not to fix themselves. Beerus tilted his head slightly. This world grew its rot very carefully, organized it, made it structural. I know, Deku said. You've been running around in the middle of my business for 4 hours. People are still in it. Yes. Beerus looked at the building where the teenager had been. They always are. The pre-dawn quiet sat between them. Not hostile, not warm. The kind of silence that holds two things that are not the same and are not pretending to be. Are any of them worth keeping? Deku said. Not defensively, not as an argument. The way you ask something you already believe the answer to, but need the other person to encounter the question as well. Beerus looked at him for a long moment. Some, he said, not enough. How do you know how many is enough? How do you know that boy with the bad ribs was worth the shoulder you've been running on for 4 hours? Deku opened his mouth, closed it. You don't calculate it, Beerus said. You just go. That's your nature. He looked away, back at the city. This world's nature is different. I find it unacceptable. I know, Deku said again. I know it's not good enough. I know there's rot. I've seen it. He looked at his hands, the gloves, the cracked gauntlet, the taped arm underneath. I'm asking if there's anything here worth the space it takes up. Beerus was quiet. Go find your next building, he said finally. You're wasting time standing here. Deku held that for half a second, then turned and went. Beerus watched him go, and did not move and did not speak. Wiss waited an appropriate interval. That was almost a conversation, Wiss observed. It was a statement of conditions, Beerus said. On both sides. Of course. Don't make it into something else. Wouldn't dream of it, Lord Beerus. The dawn came in flat and gray over the eastern zone. In what remained of the command vehicle, it had relocated twice since midnight, the second time because the first location had been too close to a structural removal. And the crew had felt the passing of something they didn't have instruments to measure. Endeavor received a report. Casualty count. Structures removed 7. Structures collapsed by secondary effect 3. Civilian casualties from the night's operations total. He read the number. He held it in the same part of himself that held Renji Toda's name. Status on Midoriya, he said. The field coordinator checked. Still active, northwest section. Tell him to report to medical when... I've told him, sir. Endeavor looked at the casualty count again. Set the report down. Then tell him to report to medical after the next one. He looked at the tactical display at the shape of what remained, at the places where Beerus had moved through the night, and what the map looked like in those places now. The structural removals had on net saved lives. The crowd pressure release in the eastern zone alone had prevented a mass casualty event that the models had been flagging for hours. The industrial block had been used to stage an asset that had killed 2 people on the way to a god's approximate location. The fact that the removals had saved lives was not something he knew how to hold simultaneously with the fact that this was not a rescue operation. It was a god deciding which parts of the city were too rotten to bother with, and people were alive because the verdict on some of those parts happened to help them, and that was not a system anyone had built or anyone could rely on. He thought about that. Then he went back to coordinating the people he could still coordinate because that was the job, and the job had not changed. All 4-1 looked at his positioning map. 4 assets in place. 2 more in transit. The collection Nomu was gone. 4 seconds of data was what they had, and it was both more and less than he'd hoped. Enough to confirm the hypothesis, not enough to act on. Tamura was not responding to contact. He had last been tracked moving northwest, which was toward the area of the zone, where the Green Hero had been operating, which was also the area where Beerus had been for the last 40 minutes. He thought about what Tamura would do when he got there. He thought about the conversation that would or would not happen, and what it would produce, and whether any of it was recoverable in terms of his operational timeline. Then he thought about the 4 seconds of data, and what they implied, and what it would mean to try to act on them anyway. He opened the channel to the final positioning team. Accelerate, he said. We move tonight. Shigaraki found the place where Deku had been. Not Deku, he'd moved on, was somewhere north now. Still going. But the shape of what he'd left behind, the building with the failed wall. The woman's impression in the settled dust where she'd been lying, the ceiling section that had come down after, rather than during. He read it like a scene. He had done something similar in reverse his whole life. Read the aftermath of heroes and tried to find the lie in it. Here there wasn't one. He kept moving north, and then he stopped because Beerus was 20 meters ahead of him and had been watching him approach for longer than was comfortable. Shigaraki did not back up this time. Still here, he said. You went away and came back, Beerus said. Most things decide. I decided? Shigaraki held his ground hands loose, no decay running. I just decided wrong the first time. And now I want to ask you the thing I should have asked in the exclusion zone. Beerus waited. When you're done, Shigaraki said, is it going to matter, any of it? The rot you removed, the people that green kid pulled out the hole. He gestured at the pre-dawn city. The absent shapes where structures had been the thin movement of survivors across open ground. Whatever this was, does any of it change anything from where you stand? Beerus regarded him with the same quality of attention he'd given Deku. No, he said. Then what's the point of the judgment? Judgment doesn't need a point. It's a response. He looked at the pre-dawn sky. This world disturbed me. I am addressing the disturbance. What comes after is not my concern. Shigaraki thought about this. That's the most honest thing anyone said to me in years, he said finally. Beerus said nothing. He looked at the place where the industrial block had been, and then at the city beyond it, and something in his manner had shifted from the quality of the last 6 hours. Not softer, nothing like softer, but differently oriented. The way a thing is, differently oriented when it has finished one assessment and is beginning another. Shigaraki recognized the shift for what it was and felt the back of his neck go cold. You've decided, Shigaraki said. I'm deciding, Beerus corrected. On the whole city, on what this world chose to build. He tilted his head. It had a long time. It made deliberate choices. Organized its rot, as I said. Put people in charge of protecting others and built systems that made that protection conditional. Decided which lives mattered in advance. He looked at Shigaraki. You spent your life trying to bring that down. Yeah, you failed. Yeah, because you were trying to replace it with something. Shigaraki went still. What? Hatred still wants, still needs, still builds toward an outcome. Beerus looked back at the city. You were never destroying, you were just renovating. You wanted the world to look different from inside the same level of existence. Shigaraki said nothing. The pre-dawn gray had started to develop into actual dawn. Thin light. The kind that shows you what the dark was hiding and rarely improves it. Go, Beerus said. Make whatever decision you've been building toward. I have one more pass to make. Shigaraki stood for a moment. Then he turned and walked north fast in the direction where he knew All for One had moved last. Not because All for One had called, because there was something that needed to be said that couldn't be left unsaid before the end. And Beerus had just told him without telling him that the end was tonight. Shigaraki found AFO in the third building, not because of the tracker that had gone dark when AFO disabled it, which he'd done the moment he understood Tomura wasn't coming back the way he'd sent him. Shigaraki found him because he knew how AFO moved, had known it since childhood, had been shaped by it the way clay is shaped by a hand that never quite lets go. He knew the radius, the sight lines, the minimum viable distance from assets, and maximum viable distance from exposure. He walked through the door without hesitation. AFO was standing at the window. Below the pre-dawn city, what remained of it was catching the first gray light. The feeds were still running on the equipment behind him. Positioning maps, asset status, the collection data from the 4-second window before the Nomu was removed. You went to find him, AFO said. Not a question. Yeah, and you talked to him. Yeah. Then you understand why the final operation has to happen now, before he completes the Eastern. I'm not doing the operation, AFO turned from the window. He looked at Shigaraki the way he had looked at him for years, with a particular assessment of a man who had built something and was checking it for structural compromise. He had looked at him that way when Shigaraki was 5, when he was 12, when he had his first kill and his 10th and the 100th. Always the same look. The look of someone who considered the thing in front of him primarily as a function. Shigaraki had known this for a long time, had chosen not to name it for reasons that made sense when he was inside them and were harder to explain from outside. Tamura, AFO said, very even. Walk me through your reasoning. You want to use me to get close enough for the final collection run. You want me in front because I'm the variable that produces a reaction, and you want to be behind the reaction collecting data from it. Shigaraki's voice had none of the old deflection in it. You've been running this play since the exclusion zone, since before. Since you put me in front of every problem you ever needed solved and stood behind it, watching what happened. That is a significant oversimplification of, I know what it is. He crossed the room and stood 4 meters from AFO, close enough that the dynamic between them was different than it had ever been in a room with this much space. I'm telling you, I know what it is. I'm not explaining it to you. I'm saying it out loud so it's been said. AFO was quiet for a moment. You intend to go back to him, he said finally. Yeah, not as an asset. No. Then as what? Shigaraki thought about it. About the conversation in the pre-dawn dark, about the way Beerus had said, you were never destroying, you were just renovating, about the specific quality of being told the truth about yourself by something that had no reason to lie and no investment in softening it. As whatever I am, he said, without you deciding what that is. He turned to go. The thing about AFO, the real thing beneath the frameworks and the calculations and the voice that had narrated Shigaraki's entire life as though it were a plan AFO was executing, was that he had never fully accepted the existence of outcomes he hadn't authored. He had planned for resistance. He had planned for failure. He had planned for Tamura's breaks and rerouted them. Every variable had a contingency. He raised his hand. Shigaraki felt it before he saw it. 20 years of learning how that particular charge sounded, how it displaced the air in a room, how it felt in the back of the teeth. He turned. The discharge hit him in the left shoulder and drove him into the wall. Old quirks accumulated layered the kind of force that AFO used when he needed something ended quickly and didn't want to waste what he considered a meaningful asset on it. Painful. Deliberate. The message was very clear. You don't leave unless I'm done with you. Shigaraki peeled himself off the wall. His shoulder was wrong. The arm wasn't working right. He looked at his own hand on the floor and thought about Beerus saying judgment doesn't need a point, it's a response. And thought about the 5-year-old on a sidewalk and thought about every system that had decided what he was before he could form the question. He got up. AFO hit him again. Harder. I have no interest in destroying you, AFO said with the tone of someone explaining a policy. But I have considerable interest in not allowing you to compromise the operation. Lie still. Shigaraki lay still. He lay still until the sound of AFO's footsteps moved toward the equipment, toward the final positioning channel, toward whatever the last piece of the plan was. Then he put his right hand on the floor and let the decay run. Beerus felt the building go. He was 6 blocks north in the open ground where 2 structures had been, and he felt it the way he felt things, not through any mechanism that could be measured, but through the simple fact that something in his radius had ceased to maintain its structural integrity in a way that was different from the general ongoing collapse of the surrounding environment. He looked south. The building had not fallen. The decay had gone through the ground floor support columns faster than he'd seen it operate before, which meant the person running it was either enraged or had stopped moderating it, and then it had traveled upward. 3 floors of material converting to gray lattice in approximately 4 seconds, and then the lattice failing, and then the building arriving at its conclusion. He watched the dust settle. In the dust cloud, one figure was moving wrong. One arm not tracking correctly. Posture compromised the gait of something that had taken significant damage and was operating past the point where the damage registered as a reason to stop. Beerus watched it move north through the gray morning light. And then he looked at the wreckage of the building. And then he looked at where the moving figure was going, which was toward him. Shigaraki walked out of the dust and stopped 10 meters out. He was a wreck. The left arm was hanging. His face had blood on it from where he'd hit the wall. He was upright through what appeared to be a principle rather than a physical condition. "I know," Shigaraki said before Beerus could speak. "I know what you see." "What do I see?" "Someone who came apart before you could make the decision." His voice was steady in the way things are steady when the person producing them has accepted something. "AFO is in there." He gestured back at the dust. "Or he's not anymore. I don't know what the decay got." "It got the building," Beerus said. "Whether it got him is a different question." Shigaraki looked at the wreckage. He would have survived worse. Beerus turned toward the building and extended one hand. The dust settled instantly. The absence where the building had been opened, like a window, into a space that simply didn't have a building in it anymore. Beerus scanned it. In the eastern corner of the cleared space behind what had been a support column, a figure in a black suit and a life support mask was standing. The decay had reached the column. It had not reached him, he'd been behind it, and the column had gone before the decay turned the corner. He was already raising his hands. Beerus looked at him with the same attention he gave to things that had moved into a category that required a response. AFO saw the look. He had spent his life reading the body language of things with power. He had built an empire on understanding what powered things wanted, feared, and could be offered. He had never encountered something that wanted nothing and feared nothing and could not be offered anything. And for the first time in a very long time, his next move was not obvious. He generated it anyway. Because that was what he was, a thing that generated the next move, regardless. The discharge was large. Every consolidated quirk he had that could produce force layered the kind of output that had leveled city blocks in a different arc of the world's history. It crossed the cleared space in a fraction of a second. Beerus raised one hand. The discharge stopped. Not deflected, it had simply encountered a premise it couldn't continue past, and in encountering it, it ceased. The air where the discharge had been was clear and still. IFO stood for a moment in the ruins of his own output. He lowered his hands. Beerus said nothing. He didn't explain, didn't announce, didn't give the moment any of the theater that AFO had been surrounded by his entire life. He simply looked at AFO the way someone looks at a problem that has been correctly identified and applied, Hakai, and AFO was not there. No sound, no light. The life support mask, which had been standing slightly apart from the body anyway, dropped to the cleared ground and settled in the rubble. Shigaraki stared at the space. "Yeah," he said after a moment. Beerus looked at him. "Your assessment," Beerus said. "Of what?" "Him." Shigaraki thought about it. He was the best at what he did. And what he did was treat everything as a component. He looked at the mask on the ground. "Including me." "Yes, and now he's gone, and none of it mattered." "That tends to be how it ends," Beerus said. "For things built around the assumption that they'll still be here to see the outcome." Deku had been in the northeast sector for the past hour and a half, working the gap between the Triage staging area and the last uncleared residential block. He had pulled 9 people out. He had missed 2. He knew he'd missed them because he'd heard them and then not heard them, and then the secondary collapse had closed the building off. And he had stood at the edge of it for 4 seconds before going to the next one. Because 4 seconds was what he allowed himself, and then he had to keep moving. He was carrying a woman on his back when the building went down 6 blocks south. He felt the percussion of it, the specific weight of a structure arriving at the ground. And he kept moving because the woman on his back was the current problem. and the collapse was 6 blocks away, and there were people between them. He delivered her to the medic station at the northern edge of the triage zone. She had a child with her. Small 4 or 5, the child had been attached to her back and had slept through most of the journey with the resilience of someone whose body had decided that the current situation was above its pay grade. And unconsciousness was the appropriate response. The woman sat down on the ground with the child in her arms and looked up at Deku and opened her mouth to speak. "You don't need to," he said. She nodded and looked at her child. Deku stood for a moment at the edge of the triage station. Around him, the staging area held perhaps 200 people. The ones who had been reached, the ones who had been carried, the ones who had followed the sound of someone moving through the dark and found their way here. Medics were working. Volunteers were distributing water. A man was sharing a blanket with a woman he had never met before tonight, and probably wouldn't remember clearly after, because the mind does not preserve the details of nights like this with any kind of fidelity. He looked south. The pre-dawn had become actual dawn. Gray was becoming a specific kind of light that fell on wreckage differently than darkness had. He could see the shape of what the city had become, the gaps where buildings had been, the altered skyline, the new geometry of a place that had been edited by something that didn't share its scale of significance. He started south. Beerus was standing in the open ground when Deku arrived. Shigaraki was there too, sitting on a piece of collapsed wall, the bad arm tucked against his body, not looking at anything in particular. He looked up when Deku came into range, and the look held for a moment the two of them, on opposite ends of a very long history that had just been made irrelevant, and then Shigaraki looked away. Deku stopped a few meters back from Beerus. He was by any objective measure a ruin. The taped shoulder had given up its structural purpose hours ago. His costume was covered in concrete dust and dried blood that was not primarily his own. He had been running for the better part of a day on the specific reserves that the body develops only when the alternative is stopping. He looked at Beerus, at the cleared space where the building had been, at the mask on the ground. "Is it over?" he said. "Almost." Deku absorbed this. "What's left?" "A pass through the southeast. The rot there concentrated in 2 blocks the apparatus that your system used to decide who deserved protection before it even began." Beerus looked in that direction. "I'm going to remove it." Deku thought about what was in the southeast. He knew those 2 blocks he'd read the pre-war records had noted the way resource allocation had flowed around them. Rather than through them, had seen in the casualty patterns of the last year how certain populations had been systematically placed further from the response infrastructure. The Commission had its headquarters in one of those blocks, the secondary licensing board in the other. He did not argue. "Is there anyone still in there?" he said. "I don't know. I'd suggest you find out." Deku turned and started running. Behind him, he heard Shigaraki say something low, not to him, to Beerus. He couldn't hear what it was, and didn't try. He ran because that was what he had. He cleared 17 people from the 2 blocks in 40 minutes. Endeavor found him on the second building, and took the 3rd floor while Deku took the 4th. Hawks ran the roof access. They didn't discuss the situation, didn't discuss the target, didn't discuss the fact that they were evacuating buildings from a judgment they had no ability to prevent. They just moved people downstairs and outdoors and away from the structures that had been identified as conclusions. Aizawa was at the perimeter directing the flow. The last person out of the Commission headquarters was a woman in her 50s. Administrative staff had been sheltering in an interior room when the primary evacuation ran, had been there for 6 hours. She came out of the door and Deku caught her because her legs weren't working correctly after 6 hours on a cold floor. And he walked her to the perimeter, and she looked back at the building and then at him. "What's going to happen to it?" she said. "I don't know exactly," Deku said. She nodded, which meant she did know, and was choosing the form of not knowing that allowed her to keep walking. He got her to Aizawa, who took her without words, which was Aizawa, and turned back. The 2 blocks were clear. He stood at the edge of the cleared perimeter and looked at the buildings and then at the figure standing at the center of the open ground to the south. And he thought about what those buildings had contained, and he thought about the woman who had been sheltering for 6 hours in an interior room. And he thought about the man in the heavy coat in the tilted building, and he thought about the 2 people who hadn't made it out of the northeast sector. He stood there. Beerus looked at him across the open ground. Deku did not move. Neither did Beerus for a moment. Then Beerus looked at the 2 buildings and raised both hands, and they were gone, both at once. Clean, the kind of absence that arrives without theater, and the space where they had been was just space. He lowered his hands. He looked at Deku. Deku held the look. "It wasn't enough," Deku said, "not an accusation. A fact stated the way you state facts at dawn after a night like this." "No," Beerus said. "It never is." Beerus said nothing. He looked at the cleared space, at the altered geography of the city, at the dawn that was now fully arrived and laying its light across wreckage that was going to require a reckoning none of the living had the language for yet. Then he looked at Deku once more with the attention he had been giving him since the 19th time and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would have been worth the saying. And that was the most honest form of acknowledgement in his register. He turned away. Shigaraki was still in the open ground. He had watched Beerus move through the southeast operation from where he was sitting, the bad arm resting in his lap. Now the decay in his hand, very quiet. He had watched the commission building go. He had watched the licensing board go. He had watched the things he'd wanted to bring down for most of his life disappear in a way that felt nothing like he'd imagined it would feel. He'd imagined satisfaction. What he felt was closer to the vertigo from the cordon, that first time, the no-bottom sensation. The structures were gone, and the thing they'd been propping up, the hunger in him that had needed something to push against, was still there, and now had nothing to push against, and he didn't know what that made him. He heard footsteps. Deku came back across the open ground and stopped a few meters away, which was a reasonable distance given everything. They looked at each other. "He's going," Shigaraki said. Deku looked where Shigaraki was looking. Beerus had moved to the edge of the cleared area and was standing with his back to the city. Whis had appeared from wherever Whis had been. He was always where he was needed. Slightly before he was needed, and the 2 of them were in a conversation too quiet to hear. "Yeah," Deku said. "Does it feel like anything?" Deku thought about the question seriously. "It feels like a lot of things that I don't have words for yet." Shigaraki looked at his right hand, at the gray lattice pattern on his fingertips that was the permanent aesthetic of who he was. "He told me I was renovating, not destroying." He paused. "I've been thinking about that." "What do you think?" "I think he might be right." A pause. "I think that's the worst thing he said to me." Deku said nothing, because there was nothing to add to that. "I'm not going to fight you," Shigaraki said. "Right now. I'm not going to fight anyone right now." "Okay, that might change." "I know." They stood in the open space, where things had been hung in the early morning light, with the sounds of the surviving city coming through from the north people and the machinery of triage and the distant management of aftermath. Not peaceful, not resolved. Just the texture of what comes immediately after the thing that defines the before and after. Shigaraki got up. The arm was bad. He had to use the wall fragment he'd been sitting on for leverage, and the movement was effortful in a way he didn't try to hide and Deku didn't comment on. He walked south through the absent spaces without looking back. Whis watched him go. "Lord Beerus," he said, "your dinner schedule at current pace would be disrupted significantly." Beerus looked at the city, at the shape it had become, the gaps, the new geometry, the altered horizon. He had removed perhaps a quarter of it, perhaps less. The infrastructure of a hero licensing apparatus that had spent 60 years deciding which populations could be left at the margins. The organized systems that had turned the concept of protection into a conditional product. A number of buildings that had simply been in the way of a noise level he found intolerable. He looked at the triage staging area to the north. The figures moving through it. The woman with the child. The man with the blanket. The volunteer who was still running on nothing but momentum. The green figure standing in the open ground watching him. "This world," Beerus said, was weighted. "It will build it again," Beerus said. "Whatever I removed. It will build something that serves the same function and call it something different. Most worlds do. That's why they need supervision." "Is that why you're here?" Beerus was quiet for a moment. "I'm here because the noodles were acceptable and I was in the area." He turned away from the city, and because some things had been wrong for long enough that looking at them had become unpleasant. And now they're less unpleasant. He looked north once more at the figure in green that was still standing and would probably still be standing in an hour when there was another building to go into. Some of them. He stepped forward. The air around him changed that displacement, that wrongness of presence withdrawing, and then it didn't change back. The space he had been standing in had been changed by him in ways that were not visible and were not going to stop being the case simply because he was no longer physically in it. The city would grow around the removed buildings the way a body grows around a wound. Not the same, not worse, different, and carrying the shape of the difference for longer than anyone currently alive would be able to remember. Was turned his staff once a small motion and fell into step beside him. "There is a restaurant," Whis said, "approximately 8 minutes from here at the appropriate velocity. The review suggests the fish preparation is, if it's mediocre, I'm going to remove the building." "Understood, though I would ask that you read the menu first." They went. The city did not cheer. There was no crowd gathering to watch the departure, no moment of collective release. What there was, the particular quality of air in a space that has been under enormous pressure for several days and is beginning not to heal, not yet, but to resume the simpler physics of existing without that pressure. Endeavor was in the triage zone. He had stopped giving orders an hour ago when there were no more orders to give that he hadn't already given. He was doing something more immediate, helping carry. Not heroically. Just moving a stretcher with a volunteer on the other end because the stretcher needed to go from one place to another and he was there and the volunteer wasn't strong enough to do it alone. When the stretcher was where it needed to be, he stopped. He looked south at the new shape of the city, at the absent buildings, at the horizon that had acquired gaps it hadn't had 72 hours ago. Hawks landed beside him, folded his wings, said nothing for a while. "Commission building is gone," Hawks said eventually. "I know. Licensing board too. I know. The entire apparatus for—" "I know what was in those buildings, Hawks." Silence. "Is that," Hawks said carefully, "a problem?" Endeavor looked at the gap in the horizon. "Ask me again in a month," he said. "Right now, I don't have the capacity for that question." Hawks considered this. "Fair." A medic came past with a clipboard. Endeavor took it without being asked, reviewed it, handed it back with 3 notations and a direction to a triage coordinator. Then he stood in the pre-morning light in the city that had been changed in ways that would take years to fully understand and breathed. Deku sat down. He hadn't sat down in almost 24 hours, and his body had been waiting politely for him to stop providing reasons not to. And now that he'd stopped it, stated its accumulated position all at once. He sat on a piece of wall that Shigaraki had been sitting on earlier and looked at the space where things had been. His hands were shaking. Not from fear, the fear had processed itself through the body during the running and was now presenting its invoice in the form of physical instability. He let the shaking happen because fighting it was a waste of effort, and there were no more things that required his effort right now. The woman with the child was 30 meters away. The child had woken up and was eating something from a foil packet, with the concentration of someone for whom the world has been reduced usefully to the immediate and the edible. The woman was watching the child eat. Nothing else, just watching. Deku watched her watch the child. This was the thing that the night had produced, along with everything else. It had produced the woman, the child, the foil packet, the eating. 19 people in the northeast sector, plus the woman on his back, plus the 17 from the southeast, plus the man in the heavy coat, plus the ones before that he'd stopped counting. People who had been in the world at the end of the night, who had not been guaranteed to be there at the start of it. Not enough, not close to enough. But he had learned in the training that was never officially training in the years of watching people who had been doing this longer absorb what was not enough. And stand back up, he had learned that not enough was not the same as nothing. That the distance between nothing and something was not scaled by the gap between something and everything. That a woman watching a child eat after a night like this was a fact with its own weight, separate from and not diminished by everything that had not been saved. He sat with that for a while, not okay, not fixed, not headed anywhere that looked like normal from here. But the woman was there. The child was there. The foil packet crinkled in the early morning air. He breathed. And somewhere to the east, the city broken gap-toothed, carrying the shape of a wound that would define its next 50 years, went on making the sounds that cities make when they are still there, which is different from being whole and is also not nothing.
If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel, and be sure to turn on notifications so you won't miss our future videos. Thank you for watching, and we will see you next time.